The human main battle tank crushed our soldiers beneath its unstoppable treads as it rolled over their bodies, its cannon blasting gaping holes through our high-tech energy shields like paper, demolishing our advanced Yadaran landing ship with a single shot. We had considered humanity weak and helpless before our vast stellar empire. We could not have been more wrong. I am Talon, an elderly Yadaran historian. In the dimly lit classroom, rows of wide-eyed Yadaran youths stare at me, hungry to learn of our species' greatest defeat. I clear my throat, preparing to recount that fateful first contact with the deceptively capable humans. Our story begins when Captain Zorak's Yadaran scout ship, the YSS Zephyr, discovers a tiny human colony on remote planet Epsilon 6. The prefab structures house only 200 civilians and 20 soldiers, meager numbers compared to our empire spanning hundreds of star systems. Adhering to protocol, Zorak deploys a ground team to assess any potential threat the primitive colony could pose to Yadaran interests. 10 of our soldiers land by the colony perimeter, outfitted with advanced energy weapons and personal force fields. Surely the humans stood no chance against Yadaran might. But as the squad approaches the settlement, a lone human soldier emerges from hiding to confront them. Noah Bryant, a grizzled veteran of the Terran Alliance's interplanetary wars, aims his archaic kinetic rifle at the Yadaran troops, 1 man against 10. Our warriors laugh at the absurd mismatch, the primitive kinetic weapon no match for their energy shields. They did not know that Bryant was not alone. They did not know about the human tank laying in ambush, and in mere moments, that arrogant laughter would turn to anguished screams as they learned the true strength of humanity, shattering the Yadaran Empire's sense of invincibility forever. I watched as Commander Zaxir approached the lone human. Our scans had shown their technology was vastly inferior to ours. What could 1 man with a primitive kinetic weapon do against a squad of Yadarans equipped with energy shields and plasma rifles? Zaxir strutted forward, towering over the human soldier. "You there, primitive? I am Commander Zaxir of the Yadaran Empire. This planet is now under our control. Surrender immediately and submit to Yadaran authority." But the human Noah Bryant stood his ground. He stared defiantly up at Zaxir, his rifle not wavering. "This colony is under the protection of the Terran Alliance. We don't recognize your claim here. I suggest you leave, now." The Yadarans burst into laughter. Zaxir smirked. How amusing that this lowly creature thought he could defy us. "You have spirit, human, but you are hopelessly outmatched. Disarm him." The squad rushed forward, energy weapons at the ready, closing in on the human. But as they approached the colony gate, a deep rumble shook the earth. The Yadarans paused, confused. The ground trembled with a heavy, rhythmic pounding, growing louder by the second. Suddenly, a monstrous armored vehicle burst through the colony walls, smashing steel and concrete aside like matchwood. It was a Terran M95 Paladin heavy tank, 70 tons of hardened battle steel and composite armor. Twin smoke launchers stood ready to hide its bulk in thick shrouds. An enormous 120mm railgun swiveled toward the Yadarans, humming with power. Inside, Bryant leapt into the gunner's seat beside Sergeant Jake Thompson and Corporal Mike Hernandez. "Load AP!" Bryant shouted as he slewed the turret around, bringing the cannon to bear on the Yadaran line. Thompson slammed a massive armor-piercing shell into the breach. The railgun roared, and a Yadaran soldier vanished in a cloud of blood and metal fragments as the hypersonic round punched through his shield and body. Zaxir barely had time to shout, "Take cover!" before the Paladin's machine gun opened up, stitching a line of craters across the ground. Yadaran shields flared and popped under the hail of armor-piercing rounds. Soldiers fell screaming as the high-caliber bullets found their marks. Zaxir dove behind a boulder, feeling his own shield shatter as a railgun round grazed him. "Fall back," he screamed. "Fall back to the lander." The Yadarans broke and ran as more shells tore into their ranks. The Paladin rumbled forward, crushing the dead and wounded beneath its treads. Bryant worked the controls with the ease of long practice, the targeting computer picking out one fleeing soldier after another. The 120mm gun blasted craters in the earth, throwing up geysers of dirt and gore. The Yadurans ran, terrified, all thoughts of their technological superiority forgotten in the face of this ferocious onslaught. Zaxir stumbled up the ramp of the lander, his arm hanging limp and shattered at his side. "Lift off!" he gasped. "Get us out of here!" The lander lurched into the sky as the paladin's parting shots dented its armored hull. I paused, looking out at my audience. The young Yadurans stared back at me in shock, struggling to process the tale of their species' first shattering defeat at the hands of the humans. This was just the beginning of the story, the start of a long and bitter lesson in humility for the Yaduran Empire. But that is a tale for another day. I cleared my throat and continued the tale, as my audience leaned forward, hungry for more details of this unprecedented clash between the Yaduran Empire and the deceptively formidable humans. Inside the paladin, Bryant watched the Yaduran shuttle climb into the sky. His face was grim, his eyes hard. "Thompson, target that shuttle. Hit their engines before they get out of range." Thompson hesitated, his hands hovering over the controls. "Sir, they're retreating. Shouldn't we let them go?" Bryant shook his head. "Negative. These aliens need to learn that they can't just roll in here and push us around. They need to understand the consequences of underestimating humanity. Take the shot, Corporal. That's an order." Aboard the fleeing shuttle, alarms blared as the armor-piercing round tore through its engine compartment. Propulsion died with a sputter, and the craft listed, clipped, trailing smoke. It slewed drunkenly through the air before slamming back into the earth, gouging a long furrow into the dirt. High above, safely in orbit, Captain Zorak paced the command deck of the YSS Zephyr. Zaxir's team had gone silent, and surface scans now showed their shuttle as a burning wreck. The humans had proven far more dangerous than anticipated. Zorak turned to his comms officer. "Dispatch a second lander with a squad of Shadowblades. I want that human weapon captured and its crew brought to me. These primates will pay for their insolence." "By your command," the comms officer replied, relaying the orders. The second Yaduran shuttle touched down near the crash site, its ramp lowering to disgorge a phalanx of black-clad warriors. The Shadowblades, the Yaduran Empire's elite commandos, secured the area with ruthless efficiency. They pulled the wounded survivors from the wreckage, including a barely conscious Zaxir. Kazarol, the grizzled leader of the Shadowblades, seized Zaxir by the front of his bloodied uniform. "Report, Commander. What in the seven hells happened down here?" Zaxir coughed, his eyes unfocused. "The humans, they had a weapon, a vehicle like a mobile artillery piece, heavily armored. It tore through our shields like they were nothing. We never stood a chance." Kazrol released Zaxir, his mind racing. If the humans possessed such advanced war machines, they were a far greater threat than the Empire had ever imagined. The Shadowblade commander activated his comlink. There was a pause before Zorak replied, his voice tight. "Agreed, Commander Kazrol. Secure that human vehicle and its crew by any means necessary. We will teach these upstarts the folly of defying the Yaduran Empire." So I paused once more, letting the magnitude of this first contact sink in for my audience. The Yaduran Empire, so assured of its own supremacy, had been brought low by a single human tank and its valiant crew. But this was only the beginning of a far greater conflict, one that would reshape the galactic balance of power forever. As the second Yaduran shuttle descended towards the crash site, Bryant watched through the Paladin's periscope, his face grim. He keyed the comm. "Governor Novak, looks like we've got more company. The Yadurans have sent reinforcements. I count 20 hostiles, heavily armed and armored." In the colony's command center, Eleanor Novak leaned over the holomap, her eyes hard. "Understood, Sergeant. We can't let them take the colony." She turned to her aide. "Initiate evacuation protocol Omega. Get the civilians to the bunkers, and tell Major Halston to mobilize our remaining security forces. I want every available soldier and Paladin tank deployed to defend the perimeter." Klaxons blared throughout the settlement as civilians rushed to the underground shelters, clutching children and precious belongings. The colony's small but determined security force mustered, checking weapons and donning armor. In minutes, 3 more M95 Paladins rumbled out of their hangars, falling into formation beside Bryant's tank. Bryant surveyed the defenses, directing his crew into position. "Thompson, Hernandez, listen up. We're going to hunker down behind that ridge. Let the Yaderans come to us. When I give the word, light 'em up." The Paladin growled as it trundled into position, its hull scraping against the rocks as it nestled into a shallow depression. Bryant fingered the trigger, watching, waiting. At the crash site, Kazral assembled his shadow blades, his face a mask of cold fury. "The humans have already cost us 1 shuttle and a full squad. This insult cannot stand. We will take their colony and drag their leaders before the Emperor in chains." The shadow blades fanned out, activating their cloaking fields. They advanced on the settlement in a silent, invisible wave, energy blades and plasma rifles at the ready. But as they neared the human perimeter, a sudden instinct made Kazral pause. Something was wrong. The defenses seemed too thin, too easily breached. And then he saw it, the faintest glint of metal behind a distant ridge. His eyes widened. "Ambush! Scatter and—" The rest of his warning was lost in the roar of the Paladin's main gun. A 120mm railgun slug ripped through the Shadowblade ranks, instantly vaporizing 2 warriors and hurling 3 more through the air like broken dolls. The cloaked Yaderans broke formation, diving for what little cover they could find. "Pour it on, boys!" Bryant roared as the other Paladins opened up, their machine guns scything through the Yaderan positions. The aliens' cloaking fields flickered and died as they took hits, revealing their positions. Kazral rolled to his feet, his armor smoking from a near miss. "Concentrate fire on those tanks," he bellowed. "Bring them down!" The Shadowblades regrouped, bringing their plasma weapons to bear. Energy bolts hammered the Paladins' hulls, scorching armor and fusing sensor arrays. One tank shuddered and went still, its treads blown off by a lucky shot. In his Paladin, Bryant gritted his teeth as alarms wailed and damage reports flooded in. The Yaderans were packing a hell of a punch, but he'd be damned if he'd let them take this colony, his home. I paused my tale, letting the young Yaderans absorb the grim details of the battle. The Shadowblades, the pride of the Yaderan military, were locked in a desperate struggle against a small band of human defenders. But for all their technological might, the Yaderans were learning a harsh lesson. That human ingenuity and determination could level the playing field in ways they had never imagined. The battle for Epsilon 6 was far from over, and the cost in blood would be high on both sides. But one thing was certain, the Yaderan Empire would never again underestimate humanity. Through the drifting smoke, I watched as plasma bolts seared the air, splashing against the Paladin's thick hull. The Shadowblades poured withering fire onto Bryant's tank, their weapons hissing and sparking with each impact, but the Paladin's armor held firm, absorbing the onslaught like a defiant juggernaut. Kazral, his face contorted with frustration, barked new orders to his warriors. Forget the body. Target the tracks, the optics, anything to cripple that monstrosity. The Shadowblades shifted their aim, plasma bolts now stitching glowing lines across the Paladin's treads and sensor arrays. Inside the tank, alarms shrilled as the damage reports flooded in. Bryant gritted his teeth, hands flying over the controls. "Thompson, Hernandez suppressing fire. Keep their heads down while I call for backup." The Paladin's machine guns roared to life, spitting a hail of bullets that chewed up the ground around the Shadowblades. The Yaderans ducked and scrambled for cover, their offensive faltering under the withering counterattack. Bryant punched the comms, his voice rising over the chaos. "Governor Novak, we need reinforcements at the perimeter. We can't hold them for long." In the bunker, Novak leaned over the tactical display, eyes hard as she watched the firefight unfold. "Understood, Sergeant. Help is on the way. Just hold the line." She turned to the soldiers around her, her voice cracking like a whip. "Get the rest of the Paladins out there now. We can't let those aliens break through." Engines roared to life as the 3 remaining M95s rolled out of their hangars, their hulls gleaming under the emergency lights. The tank commanders barked orders, guiding their machines through the colony's winding streets, past hastily erected barricades and huddles of frightened civilians. As they neared Bryant's position, the Paladin's sensors lit up with hostile contacts. The Shadow Blades had spread out, small teams taking up positions in the shattered ruins of buildings and behind wrecked vehicles. The lead Paladin's commander, a grizzled veteran named Hawkins, growled into the comms, "All units, weapons free, light 'em up!" The night erupted with the thunder of cannons and the scream of railguns as the Paladins engaged the Shadow Blades. 120mm shells blasted holes in walls and sent Yardaran warriors flying like rag dolls. Machine gun fire stitched glowing lines through the darkness, finding flesh and armor with equal ease. But the Shadow Blades gave as good as they got. Plasma bolts hammered the Paladins' hulls, scorching armor and melting sensor arrays. One tank shuddered to a halt, its treads blown off by a lucky shot. Amidst the carnage, I marveled at the sheer destructive power on display. The once quiet colony had become a war zone, its structures blasted to rubble, its streets churned to mud by the passing of giant war machines. Fires raged unchecked, casting a hellish glow over the battlefield. And in the middle of it all, Bryant's Paladin fought on, a wounded beast still defiant, but even its legendary armor could not hold out forever. A searing plasma bolt struck the tank's main sensor cluster, instantly reducing it to molten slag. Inside, Bryant cursed as his displays went dark, leaving him blind. Hernandez leapt from his seat, hands already diving into the guts of the damaged systems. "I'm on it, boss, just give me a minute." Thompson, his face lit by the glow of his targeting scope, kept the railgun thundering. He fired blindly, guided only by the Paladin's battle AI and his own instincts. Each shot was a prayer, a desperate plea to keep the enemy at bay for just a few moments longer. Casrul's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the battlefield, his gaze settling on Bryant's tank. The Paladin sat motionless, its main sensor array a smoking ruin. The Shadow Blade commander saw his chance. He barked into his comlink, "All units, converge on that damaged tank. Cloak and move in for the kill." The Shadow Blades, their armor shimmering as their cloaking fields engaged, began to advance on the crippled Paladin. They moved with practiced stealth, their footsteps barely disturbing the rubble-strewn ground. Inside the tank, Bryant gripped the controls, his knuckles white. "Hernandez, we need those sensors back online now." "Almost got it, boss," Hernandez called back, his hands a blur as he worked to bypass the damaged systems. Outside, the Shadow Blades closed in, plasma rifles aimed at the Paladin's vulnerable points. They were mere meters away when a sudden roar split the air. 3 more Paladins crested the ridge, their engines howling. The lead tank fired its railgun round, blasting a Shadow Blade into bloody mist. The others opened up with their machine guns, stitching the ground with high-caliber rounds. The Shadow Blades scattered, their cloaks flickering as they took hits. Plasma bolts flashed back in retaliation, splashing against the Paladin's thick hides. Casrul cursed, ducking behind a shattered wall as a railgun slug whipped past his head. "Fall back," he shouted into his comlink. "Regroup at the landing site." The Shadow Blades disengaged, bounding back towards their shuttle in a fighting retreat. The Paladins pursued, their guns hammering the fleeing Yardarans. In Bryant's tank, Hernandez let out a whoop as the sensors flared back to life. "We're back online!" "About damn time," Bryant growled. He keyed the comm. "All units, the Yardarans are in full retreat. Press the attack. Don't let a single one escape." The 4 Paladins surged forward, rolling over the Yardaran dead. They fired as they moved, railguns and machine guns barking in unison. The Shadow Blades fell before them, cut down as they ran. Casrul stumbled up the ramp of the shuttle, his armor pitted and scorched. Only a handful of his warriors made it back with him, their faces ashen with shock. As the shuttle lifted off, fleeing the carnage below, Casrul slumped against the wall. The human tanks had torn through his elite soldiers like they were nothing. All their technological superiority had been useless against the humans' raw ferocity and skill. The bitter taste of defeat filled Casrul's mouth. The Yadaran Empire had made a grave mistake in underestimating these humans, and now they had paid for that mistake in blood. I paused, letting the weight of the human victory sink in. The young Yadarans stared at me, their eyes wide. This was not the story they had expected, not the easy triumph they had been raised to believe in. I leaned forward, my voice low. The Battle of Epsilon 6 was just the beginning, I said. A small skirmish in the grand scheme of things, but it was a turning point, a moment when humanity showed the galaxy what it was truly capable of. The Yadaran Empire had been shaken to its core, its confidence shattered. And as word of the human victory spread, other species began to take notice. Some saw humanity as a potential ally against Yadaran aggression. Others saw a new threat rising. But one thing was certain. The galaxy would never be the same again. The human-Yadaran war was about to begin, and it would reshape the very fabric of galactic civilization. The question was, would humanity rise to meet this challenge? Or would it, like so many species before it, be crushed beneath the heel of Yadaran might? Only time would tell. I turned my gaze back to the audience, their eyes wide with shock at the stunning human victory on Epsilon 6. But as I prepared to continue the tale, I could see the question forming on their lips. What happened next? How did the Yadaran Empire respond to this humiliating defeat? The answer came swiftly. High above Epsilon 6, on the bridge of the YSS Zephyr, Captain Zorak fumed as he watched the remnants of the Shadowblade strike force limp back to the ship. Their armor was scorched and rent, their numbers decimated by the human defenders and their infernal tank. Zorak slammed a fist on his console, the metal denting under the blow. This was unacceptable. The humans had made a mockery of Yadaran might, and that could not stand. He turned to his communications officer. "Get me high command, now." The comms officer nodded, his fingers flying over the controls. A moment later, the view screen flickered to life, revealing the stern visage of Yadaran High Commander Zorval. "Report, Captain. What news from Epsilon 6? Zorak straightened, his jaw tightening. "High Commander, I regret to inform you that our initial assault on the human colony has failed. The humans possess advanced ground combat vehicles, heavily armored and armed. Our troops were outmatched." Zorval's eyes narrowed, his voice low and dangerous. "You mean to tell me that a primitive species with barely interstellar capability defeated our elite Shadowblades? Explain yourself, Captain." Zorak swallowed, choosing his next words carefully. "The humans appear to have been underestimated, High Commander. Their military technology, while primitive compared to our own, is still formidable. We require a more substantial force to secure the planet." There was a long, tense moment of silence. Then Zorval leaned forward, his eyes hard. "Very well, Captain. You shall have your force. I am ordering a full-scale invasion of Epsilon 6. You will assemble a fleet of our finest warships and ground troops. Crush this human resistance and secure that world for the Yadaran Empire. Failure will not be tolerated." "By your command, High Commander." Zorak bowed his head as the view screen went dark. He turned to his bridge crew, his voice ringing out. "You heard the orders. Assemble the fleet. We invade Epsilon 6 at once." In the depths of space, Yadaran warships began to gather. A vast armada bristling with weapons and filled with legions of Yadaran troops. Transports loaded with tanks, artillery, and air support craft. The might of the Yadaran Empire was on the move, and its target was clear. Epsilon 6 would fall and the humans would learn the price of defiance. But even as the Yadaran fleet mobilized, word of the impending invasion reached the human colony. In her bunker beneath the settlement, Governor Novak watched the sensor feeds with growing dread. The Yadaran ships hung in orbit like a swarm of angry hornets, poised to strike. She turned to her communications officer. "Send an emergency transmission to Terran Alliance Command. Inform them of our situation and request immediate assistance. If the Yadarans attack in force, we won't be able to hold them." The comms officer nodded, his face grim. "Yes, Governor, but even if the Alliance sends help, they may not arrive in time. We're on our own for now." Novak's eyes hardened, her voice steady. "Then we fight with what we have. Our people did not come this far to surrender our home to alien invaders. If the Yadarans want Epsilon 6, they'll have to pay for every inch with blood. Far across the stars, in the gleaming halls of Terran Alliance headquarters, the plea from Epsilon 6 did not go unheard. Admiral Marcus Blackwell, a grizzled veteran of countless battles, read the report with a deepening frown. He turned to his staff, his voice grave. Epsilon 6 is under threat of Yadaran invasion. Governor Novak reports they have already repelled one attack, but a much larger force is inbound. The Admiral's gaze swept the room, his officers standing straight and attentive. I don't need to tell you what's at stake here. If the Yadarans take Epsilon 6, it will be a staging ground for further aggression, a foothold in our space. He pointed to a holographic star map, Epsilon 6's location glowing red. I want the 5th Fleet mobilized immediately, with the TAS Invictus at the tip of the spear. We're going to show these Yadarans what happens when they mess with human worlds. As the Terran fleet mustered, speeding towards Epsilon 6 at maximum burn, I could feel the tension in the room. My audience leaned forward, hanging on every word. They knew, as I did, that the coming battle would be a pivotal moment in the history of our two species. On one side, the Yadaran war machine, vast and implacable, sure of its own superiority. On the other, the human defenders, outgunned and outnumbered, but filled with grim determination to protect their home. And caught between them, the tiny colony of Epsilon 6, the spark that had ignited a powder keg. As the fleets converged, the very stars seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the storm to break. I paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. The battle for Epsilon 6 was about to begin, and its outcome would shape the destiny of the galaxy. The young Yadarans leaned forward, eyes wide, as I prepared to recount the titanic clash that followed, a battle that would echo through the ages. Talon paused, letting the tension build as the young Yadarans leaned forward, eager to hear how the battle unfolded. He took a deep breath, then plunged into the tale once more. As the Yadaran invasion force arrived in Epsilon 6's orbit, the colony's defenders could only watch in growing dread. The alien fleet was a fearsome sight, their angular ships bristling with advanced weaponry that far outclassed anything the humans possessed. On the planet's surface, Sergeant Bryant and his fellow soldiers prepared for the inevitable assault. They knew their chances of survival were slim, but they were determined to fight to the last. In the command bunker, Governor Novak pored over tactical displays, her face grim. Bryant's grip tightened on his weapon. We'll give them a fight they won't soon forget, he growled. Outside, the sky lit up as the Yadaran ships opened fire, their energy beams slamming into the colony's shields. The ground shook with each impact, buildings crumbling under the onslaught. But just as all seemed lost, a new wave of sensor contacts appeared on the screens. Novak's eyes widened. It's the Terran fleet, they made it. The TAS Invictus and its escort ships swept out of hyperspace, guns already blazing as they bore down on the Yadaran invaders. On the flagship's bridge, Admiral Blackwell barked orders, his crew moving with practiced efficiency. The two fleets clashed in a titanic display of firepower. Energy beams and missiles crisscrossed the void, shields flaring and hulls buckling under the tremendous forces unleashed. The Terran ships were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought with grim determination, their advanced defenses absorbing the worst of the Yadaran assault. On Epsilon 6, Bryant saw his chance. "All units, advance!" he roared. "Hit them while they're distracted." The Yadarans, caught between the hammer of the Terran fleet and the anvil of the colony's defenders, fought back savagely. Energy beams and plasma bolts filled the air, soldiers on both sides falling by the dozens. But the humans refused to yield. They knew every inch of the colony's terrain, every choke point and ambush site, and they used that knowledge to deadly effect, leading the Yadarans into kill zone after kill zone. In orbit, the Invictus shuddered under a barrage of enemy fire, its shields barely holding. On the bridge, Blackwell gritted his teeth as damage reports flooded in. Blackwell's eyes narrowed. "We don't need to win," he said grimly. "We just need to buy the colony more time." He turned to his comm officer. "Signal all ships. Concentrate fire on the Yadaran flagship. Let's show them what human resolve looks like." As the battle raged on, the fate of Epsilon 6, and perhaps all of humanity, hung in the balance. The Yadarans were learning, to their great cost, that the human spirit was not so easily broken, but the price of that lesson would be paid in blood and fire. Talon let his words hang in the air, the image of the desperate struggle vivid in the minds of his audience. The battle was far from over, and the young Yadarans were beginning to understand the depths of courage and sacrifice that humanity was capable of. But the true cost of the colony's survival, and the scars it would leave on both species, was yet to be revealed. Talon's voice rose as he described the climax of the battle, his audience hanging on every word. In the skies above Epsilon 6, the Terran fleet clashed with the Yadaran invaders, the fate of the colony hanging in the balance. On the bridge of the TAS Invictus, Admiral Blackwell watched the tactical displays with a keen eye. The Yadaran ships were more numerous, but the Terran vessels were holding their own, their superior maneuverability and advanced shields proving crucial. Blackwell turned to his tactical officer. "Lieutenant, focus our fire on the Yadaran flagship. If we can take out their command ship, we might just turn the tide." The officer nodded, his fingers flying over the console. "Aye, sir, all batteries target the YSS Zephyr. Fire on my mark." The Invictus shuddered as its guns roared to life, hurling a barrage of missiles and energy beams at the Zephyr. The Yadaran ship's shields flared under the onslaught, struggling to absorb the tremendous energies unleashed against it. On the Zephyr's bridge, alarms blared and consoles sparked as the ship took hit after hit. Captain Zorak gripped the armrest of his chair, his knuckles white. "Status report," he barked, his voice strained. "Shields at 30% and falling, sir," the tactical officer replied, panic creeping into his voice. "Hull breaches on decks 4 through 7. Main power is fluctuating." Zorak's eyes widened as another volley from the Invictus slammed into the Zephyr, the ship lurching violently. He knew then that the battle was lost. "Signal the retreat," he ordered, his voice heavy with defeat. "Recall all ground forces. We're pulling out." As the Yadaran ships began to disengage, the Terran fleet pressed their advantage, chasing the retreating vessels and inflicting further damage. On the surface of Epsilon 6, Bryant and his tank crew witnessed the Yadaran retreat with a mix of relief and grim satisfaction. They had held the line against impossible odds, but the cost had been high. The once pristine colony was now a war-torn wasteland, buildings reduced to rubble and streets choked with the wreckage of battle. The M95 Paladins, their armor scorched and dented, rumbled through the devastation, hunting down the last pockets of Yadaran resistance. Bryant, his face streaked with sweat and grime, guided his tank through the ruins, the cannon swiveling as he searched for targets. Beside him, Thompson and Hernandez manned their stations, their eyes hard and focused. "There!" Thompson called out, pointing to a group of Yadaran soldiers making a desperate dash for their landing craft. 2 o'clock, range 500 meters. Bryant swung the turret around, the targeting reticle settling on the fleeing Yadarans. He squeezed the trigger, and the railgun roared, the hypersonic round tearing through the enemy formation and sending bodies flying. The remaining Yadarans scattered, their courage broken as the Paladins closed in. The human tanks rolled over the Yadaran dead, crushing their advanced weapons and armor beneath their treads. As the last of the alien soldiers fled the planet, a ragged cheer went up from the human defenders. They had done the impossible, repelling an invasion by a vastly superior foe. Governor Novak emerged from the bunker, her face a mix of exhaustion and pride, as she surveyed the battered but unbroken colony. The survivors gathered around her, their faces streaked with tears of joy and sorrow. "We have paid a heavy price," Novak said, her voice heavy with emotion. "But we have shown the galaxy that humanity will not be cowed, that we will fight to the last breath to defend what is ours." She turned to Bryant and his crew, who stood beside their battle-scarred tank. and we owe a special debt to Sergeant Bryant and his team. Without their courage and skill, we would surely have fallen. The colonists erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the ruined streets. Bryant and his crew stood tall, their faces flushed with pride and humility. Talon paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. The young Yaderans stared at him, their expressions a mix of shock and grudging respect. "The Battle of Epsilon 6 was a turning point," Talon said, his voice low and solemn. "It showed that humanity was not a race to be trifled with, that we would fight with everything we had to protect our own." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. But it was only the beginning. The Yaderan Empire had been humbled but not defeated, and as word of the human victory spread, other powers began to take notice. The old historian's gaze swept the room, his audience hanging on his every word. The galaxy was about to change, and humanity would be at the center of it all. But that, my young friends, is a story for another time. As the echoes of the battle faded, I watched the Yaderan fleet limp away from Epsilon 6, their once proud ships battered and broken. The Terran fleet, victorious but not unscathed, held position in orbit, standing guard over the beleaguered colony. In the halls of the Yaderan High Command, the mood was somber. The generals and admirals, so confident in their superiority, now found themselves grappling with the bitter taste of defeat. They pored over the battle reports, their faces grim as they confronted the undeniable truth. The humans, once dismissed as primitives, had proven themselves to be a formidable foe. The Yaderan Emperor, his voice tight with anger and humiliation, ordered a withdrawal from the outlying territories. "We must consolidate our strength," he declared, his eyes hard. "We cannot afford another Epsilon 6. As the Yaderans retreated, the Terran alliance moved to fill the void. Human ships, once confined to their own small corner of the galaxy, now ranged far and wide, establishing new colonies and forging alliances with other species. The Terrans, emboldened by their victory, began to assert themselves as a major power in the galactic community. On Epsilon 6, life slowly returned to normal. The colonists, led by Governor Novak, set about rebuilding their shattered homes and infrastructure. The M95 paladins, their armor scarred but their spirits unbroken, stood watch over the colony, a symbol of human resilience and determination. In their vast, incomprehensible minds, the Kalthak saw an opportunity. They began to manipulate events from behind the scenes, their influence subtle but far-reaching. They whispered in the ears of politicians and generals, sowed discord and mistrust among the various species, and set the stage for a conflict that would shake the very foundations of the galaxy. Sergeant Bryant and his crew, having survived the crucible of Epsilon 6, found themselves at the forefront of this new struggle. Their skills and experience, honed in the heat of battle, would be put to the test like never before as they faced an enemy unlike any they had ever encountered. I looked out at the young Yaderans, their faces a mix of awe and trepidation. "The Battle of Epsilon 6 was just the beginning," I said, my voice heavy with the weight of history. "The galaxy is a vast and dangerous place, filled with wonders and horrors beyond our imagining." I leaned forward, my eyes intense. "The lesson of Epsilon 6 is not that humans are superior, or that the Yaderans are weak. It is that we must never underestimate the potential of any species, no matter how primitive or insignificant they may appear." As the students filed out of the classroom, their minds buzzing with the implications of the tale they had just heard, I sat back in my chair, my thoughts turning to the future. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with challenges and obstacles that would test the limits of both human and Yaderan ingenuity. But I knew that if we could learn to work together, to put aside our differences and face the unknown as one, then perhaps we might just have a chance. The Kalthak, for all their power and mystery, were not invincible. They could be beaten, but only if we stood united. I sighed, my mind wandering to Bryant and his crew. They were out there somewhere on the front lines of this new conflict, fighting for the future of us all. I could only hope that they would be up to the task, that they would find the strength and courage to face whatever lay ahead. The ship's engines hummed as the TAS Invictus sliced through the void, its hull gleaming in the starlight. On the bridge, Admiral Blackwell stood before the view screen, his eyes fixed on the distant stars. Beside him, a holographic display flickered to life, revealing the face of a Terran intelligence officer. "Admiral, we've picked up some unusual energy readings from the Vega system," the officer said, his voice tight with concern. "Our long-range sensors detect massive gravitational anomalies and subspace distortions. Something big is happening out there." "Possibly," the officer replied. "We've never seen readings like this before. Whatever it is, it's unlike anything we've encountered." The Admiral nodded, his jaw set. "Set a course for Vega. I want a full sensor sweep of the system as soon as we arrive, and put the fleet on high alert. If the Calthac are making their move, we need to be ready." As the Invictus banked towards its new heading, Blackwell turned to his communications officer. "Get me Sergeant Bryant. I have a feeling we're going to need him and his crew on this one." In the depths of space, the Calthac stirred, their vast consciousness reaching out across the stars. The pieces were in motion, the board set for a game that would determine the fate of the galaxy, and in the middle of it all, the humans and the Yardarans, once bitter enemies, now found themselves as unlikely allies in a struggle that would test the very limits of their strength and resolve. The lights of the Invictus glinted off the pitted and scarred hull of the M95 Paladin as it was loaded into the battleship's hangar bay. In the tank's cockpit, Sergeant Bryant ran his hands over the controls, his eyes hard. Beside him, Thompson and Hernandez checked their weapons and gear, their faces grim. They knew, as did every man and woman aboard the Invictus, that they were heading into the unknown. The Calthac were an enemy, unlike any they had faced before, a force that defied understanding or reason. But they also knew that they had no choice. The fate of the galaxy, of their homes and loved ones, depended on them. As the hangar doors closed and the Invictus prepared to jump to hyperspace, Bryant looked out at the stars, his mind filled with a strange mix of fear and determination. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges or dangers they might face, he knew that they would face them together. Humans and Yardarans, once enemies, now united by a common cause. And in that moment, as the Invictus leapt forward into the void, Bryant felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be long and hard, but they would walk it together, step by step, until the end. The Calthac, for all their power, would learn the same lesson that the Yardarans had learned on Epsilon 6. Never underestimate the strength of those who fight for what they believe in. The Invictus shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace on the edge of the Vega system. On the bridge, Admiral Blackwell leaned forward in his chair, his eyes widening as he took in the sight before him. The system was in chaos. Planets had been wrenched from their orbits, their surfaces cracked and bleeding molten rock. Stars flickered and danced like candle flames in a breeze, their light twisted and distorted by the gravitational anomalies that rippled through space. And at the center of it all, a vast swirling vortex of energy, a maelstrom of light and shadow that seemed to devour everything around it. Blackwell felt a chill run down his spine as he stared into the heart of the storm, knowing that somewhere within lay the Calthac. "Sensors are going haywire, Admiral," the science officer reported, his voice shaking. "Gravitational readings are off the scale. It's like the fabric of space-time itself is coming apart." Blackwell nodded, his face grim. "Battle stations. Bring the fleet to full alert and get me Sergeant Bryant. Tell him to prepare for deployment." In the hangar bay, Bryant and his crew climbed into their Paladin, the familiar hum of the engines filling the cockpit. They had faced many challenges together, but none like this. The Calthac were a mystery, a force beyond their understanding. But they knew that they had to find a way to stop them before it was too late. As the Invictus moved deeper into the system, the vortex loomed larger on the view screen, its swirling depths seeming to beckon them forward. Bryant gripped the controls tighter, his eyes narrowed. Whatever lay ahead, whatever dangers they might face, they would face them head-on. For the sake of the galaxy, for the sake of all they held dear, they had to succeed. Failure was not an option. The Calthac, Whatever they were, whatever they wanted would be stopped, no matter the cost. The Invictus shuddered as a blast of energy erupted from the vortex, washing over the ship's shields in a cascade of sparks. On the bridge, alarms blared and consoles flickered as the crew struggled to maintain control. "Shields down to 60%, the tactical officer shouted over the din. "Hull breach on deck 7. Blackwell gritted his teeth, his hands flying over the controls. "Evasive maneuvers, get us out of here." But even as the Invictus banked and twisted, trying to evade the Calthak's attack, more blasts of energy slammed into the ship, rocking it violently. In the hangar bay, Bryant and his crew held on for dear life as the Paladin skidded across the deck, sparks flying from its treads. "We can't take much more of this," Hernandez shouted, his face pale. "The tank systems are overloading." Bryant nodded grimly, his mind racing. They had to find a way to strike back, to take the fight to the Calthak, but how could they fight an enemy they couldn't even see? Suddenly an idea struck him. It was desperate, perhaps even suicidal, but it was their only chance. His crew stared at him in disbelief. "Going in?" Thompson repeated, his eyes wide. "Into that thing?" Bryant nodded, his jaw set. "It's the only way. We have to take the fight to them. Hit them where they live." For a moment, there was silence in the cockpit. Then, slowly, Thompson and Hernandez nodded. They knew the risks, knew the odds were against them, but they also knew that Bryant was right. It was their only chance. As the Paladin roared to life, its engines screaming, Bryant keyed the comm. "Admiral Blackwell, this is Sergeant Bryant. We're going in. Wish us luck." On the bridge of the Invictus, Blackwell stared at the view screen, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He knew what Bryant was planning, knew the chances of success were slim, but he also knew that he had no choice. "Godspeed, Sergeant," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Give 'em hell." The Paladin burst from the hangar bay in a blaze of thrusters, its armored hull glinting in the light of the vortex. Bryant gripped the controls tightly, his eyes narrowed as he guided the tank towards the heart of the maelstrom. Around them, space twisted and warped, the laws of physics bending to the Calthak's will. Energy surged and crackled, threatening to tear the Paladin apart at any moment, but Bryant and his crew held fast, their determination unbreakable. As they plunged deeper into the vortex, the Calthak's presence pressed down on them like a physical weight, a force that sought to crush their minds and spirits. But they pushed back, their wills as strong as the armor that protected them. And then suddenly they were through, emerging into a realm beyond their understanding, a place where the very fabric of reality was torn and bleeding, where the rules of the universe held no sway. Before them the Calthak waited, their vast forms twisting and writhing in the void. Bryant stared at them, his heart pounding in his chest. They were like nothing he had ever seen, nothing he could ever have imagined. But he knew what he had to do, knew that the fate of the galaxy rested on his shoulders. With a roar of defiance, he brought the Paladin's main gun to bear, the weapon glowing with barely contained power. The Calthak, sensing the threat, turned their attention to the tiny metal beast that dared to challenge them. Energy surged and crackled between them, a battle of wills and weapons that would determine the fate of worlds. The Paladin shuddered and bucked, its shield straining to hold back the onslaught. But Bryant and his crew held fast, their eyes locked on their foe. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.